Now joining us for another Mangrew one-on-one from Washington, D.C. is former 2008 presidential candidate and current Republican U.S. Congressman from Texas, Dr. Ron Paul. Dr. Paul, glad to have you on the show today.
Good, thank you. Good to be with you.
White House Budget Director Peter Orszag recently stated that the U.S. is in no imminent danger of facing a Greece-like crisis. However, not everybody shares that opinion. What's your take on the situation?
Well, I don't think it's going to be next week or next month, but we're destined to reach that point someday if we continue to do what we're doing. And the only reason we're not there already is because of perceptions. We are a wealthy country. We still have more wealth than any other country. And also it's perceived that our dollar is strong compared to other currencies. So therefore there's a lot of trust placed in us. And a currency and a system can be trusted not only because of economic wealth, but also of military power. So there are some subjective elements involved. But we have embarked on too much spending, and we are at a point now where our debt is so great we can't pay for it. And when you get to this point, debt has to be liquidated, and that's what the market is fighting. The market says liquidate the debt, get rid of the malinvestment, but politicians always say no, patch it up, keep it going, keep inflating, keep the bubbles going. But eventually we will meet the same fate as the Greeks have, and then it'll be trouble. It might not work its way out just as it has in Greece, because somebody's going to come to the rescue of Greece and that's going to be papered over. But when it hits us, there's nobody that comes to paper it over. And there are signs already that inflation is raising its ugly head, and in truth, if you measure our dollar in terms of gold, the dollar is getting weaker every day.
Now, since the Goldman Sachs SEC lawsuit, the financial reform bill has been getting a lot of attention, yet problems such as subprime, deficit spending, and easy money Fed policies are not even mentioned in the bill. Could there ever be financial reform without addressing these issues?
Absolutely not. It can't be, because what they're doing is they're patching up a frail financial system by doing more of the same. We got into the trouble because we had too much spending and too much debt, too much regulation, too much printing money. And so once we hit the trouble a couple of years ago, what we did was we increased all of those things, and it just delays the inevitable. It's like giving drugs to a drug addict. Yeah, the addict feels a little bit better, but eventually the patient dies if you don't get them off the drugs.
Now, some experts, they point to the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated banking from stock trading as one of the precursors to the bank crisis of 2008, where banks were allowed to take excessive risk. Would you be in favor of bringing back this regulation?
Well, it's interesting. I voted on the Glass-Steagall change, and I voted against it. The free market, though, would not have a Glass-Steagall. Banks could do what they want, and they'd have to suffer the consequence. The reason I voted against it, that bill had some bad parts to it, but one of the reasons I argued against repealing it, it was that it was going to put a greater burden on the banks, and the taxpayer was at greater risk through the FDIC and other insurance programs of the government. So I saw that as a greater burden on the taxpayer and voted against it. But I'm for the free market and free market banking, therefore you would have no rules against banks being involved in commercial and investment banking.
Now, it's no secret that you're against any type of new tax, and recently the Obama administration has been floating out the idea of implementing a VAT tax. Would you support a VAT tax if it were accompanied, let's say, by an elimination of the corporate tax or a personal income tax removal as a more efficient means of taxation?
Well, there's a slight possibility if it was very, very clean and you absolutely prohibited an income tax or corporate tax from existing. If you had only a value-added tax or a sales tax to replace it, and you had certainly that's what would happen, yes, I'd be pretty tempted to go along with it. I've not gotten on any bills like that, whether it's the so-called fair tax or a VAT tax, because inevitably they always need more money here. And just the whole idea that let's say they come up with a VAT tax, oh, we're only going to make it 1%, it's not going to be a great burden, it's going to take care of all our problems. I would be absolutely opposed to it, because that, of course, is the way the income tax started. 1% tax, and before you know it, look at the tax code that we have now. So unless the people are sincere about cutting back, you can't really revamp the tax code. The tax code and the burden of taxation is a secondary consequence to the attitude of the American people they have toward what they want their government to do. As long as the American people think that we have to police the world and have this world empire and that we have to take care of people from cradle to grave, no tax system will work. So you have to change the philosophy of government. Then you can do away with the income tax and not replace it with anything, just as we had before 1913.
Now, for some time, the U.S. is trying to label China as a currency manipulator and has publicly pressured China to revalue their currency. If you were in charge, what would your approach be to this?
I just totally ignore them. I mean, we manipulate our currency all the time. I mean, we work real hard at weakening our currency. It's interesting that we have a weak currency, and to me, that is a problem. And we're demanding that we even need a weaker currency against the Chinese yuan.
Now, with the Tea Party gaining movement here in the United States, there's a growing amount of Americans that feel that once you're elected to government office, you should do your job and then leave, as opposed to being in office for life, as many modern-day politicians tend to do. Do you support that stance, and would you ever call it a day in Congress after your 20-plus years of service?
I don't think ultimately term limits will solve the problem. I think the only thing that solves the problem is the philosophy of government and what the attitude is of the people and what they think the role of government ought to be. Because term limits would be fine if you knew the people that were coming in had new ideas and different ideas and want to change things. But that is not the answer. But if the vote came up again, I'd probably still support term limits because it would be a token help, but not a solution.
A final question. Congressman Paul, you've dedicated your life to medicine, finance, and government, yet there's still many talents you possess that a lot of people just don't know about. For instance, you were a track and field champion growing up. If you had to choose a different career path, where do you think you'd be?
Well, if my knees would have held up, maybe I could have made it a little bit further in sports, because I love sports, I love track, I love baseball, and I love football. And when I was in high school and in college, I was large for my age, especially in high school. So I think a career in athletics would have been just great. But if I had my real dreams of doing something different than getting into politics, I would come back as a singer. But I have no chance of doing that in this lifetime, so I'll have to just dream about that.
Ron Paul coming soon to American Idol?
Hardly.
Ron Paul, former 2008 presidential candidate and current U.S. Congressman from Texas. Congressman Paul, thank you very much for coming on the show today.
You're welcome.